Hey, welcome to Whitefields Community Church Sermon Extra. It's great to have you with us once again. This week I'm here with Pastor Nick Cady, who is the pastor of Whitefields Community Church here in Longmont, Colorado. And we are currently going through a series called Remember the Prophets, taken from James chapter 5, verse 10, where James encourages us to look at the lives of the prophets. And when we've been doing that, looking at their lives, looking at the message that God brought to the people that they were called to minister to, and also to us. And we've been gleaning valuable, information and valuable insights and things that we can practical application, and also just insights into the gospel and insights into God's character. And we are at the book of Daniel this week, and Daniel on the title, world record for longest sermon title, How to Live a God-Honoring Life in a Hostile Environment. And it was a great message on Sunday, and the home groups and community groups had a great time just discussing just some of the things that were brought up in that sermon. But the question for today is, of course, Daniel, one of the main things of Daniel is prophecy. And you weren't able to cover that because that's probably, 10 sermons in itself. But so what can you just add, for the sake of our viewers to this study on the idea of prophecy and what Daniel brought about?
Yeah. So Daniel is a prophetic book, and it contains a lot of predictive prophecy, especially predictive at the time when Daniel wrote these things and spoke these things. A few things I found were really interesting about Daniel is that he was a contemporary of Ezekiel, who we'll be studying in the next study. And interestingly, Ezekiel is a priest who serves the people in exile and prophesies. Daniel, on the other hand, he works for the government, and he's a godly man, and the Lord gives him dreams and prophetic messages. So some of the things that's really important to know about Daniel are that his book contains so much predictive prophecy that was fulfilled in the time after he wrote it and the time before Jesus, what we call the intertestamental period, the 400 so-called silent years in between the end of the Old Testament prophets and the Gospel of Matthew and the coming of Jesus. So those 400 years, sometimes this is also known as the Maccabean period, which is really only a part of that 400 years. But a lot of the things that Daniel talks about were fulfilled in the Maccabean period. And for that reason, there were later scholars, like we call them textual criticism and historical criticism, who looked at Daniel and they said, this couldn't possibly have been written before the Maccabean period because it so specifically talks about exactly what happened. And there's a few things to know about that. One is that they tried to then give a later date to Daniel, where they said Daniel was probably written in 52 AD even, or some people would say 52 BC, or that kind of era. There are a few reasons why we trust that Daniel was actually written when it was written. One of them is that Jesus himself talks about Daniel, and he says, when you see the abomination of desolation which was mentioned by the prophet Daniel. So Jesus mentions Daniel as a prophet. That means that people at Jesus' time were already familiar with his book, and they were familiar with the prophecies in it. And Jesus spoke of that abomination of desolation, interestingly, as something which was still yet to come, which is very interesting because, there was something that happened during the Maccabean period, which was very similar, whereas desolation of the temple during the Maccabean period under the Seleucians and all this stuff. So I think, though, the biggest issue with this, and we saw this with Isaiah too, is that people who discount the fact that these were predictive prophecies that were then fulfilled, what they have is they have already come to the text with a presupposition. And we should always question our presuppositions, right? Like, we should always think about them and be conscious of them. The presupposition is this: well, you can't really predict the future. Nobody can predict the future. And therefore, if something claims to predict the future, well, then it must be misrepresenting itself, right? Mm-hmm. Like, it can't actually, because that can't happen. Well, that's a presupposition. And there's a lot involved in that, right? So there's beliefs about God. There's beliefs about how God communicates to people that are all wrapped up in that conclusion where you decided ahead of time, before you even looked at the validity of something, that it couldn't have been predictive and been predicting something that happened later after it was written or spoken. And so I think that just right there, you can see a very crucial flaw in that concept that this must have been written later. It couldn't have been predicted. Clearly, there's a belief system embedded in that, and that belief system is that God doesn't speak to people, and that people can't hear from God and know these predictive prophecies. Interestingly, Isaiah says exactly that, or through Isaiah, God says that. He says, here's how you will know that I am God. I will tell you the future, right? And he says, and then you can test it. And if it really was how I said it would be, then you'll know that I am God. And he says, unlike the gods that you make with your own hands out of wood or out of stone, things that you took and fashioned for yourself, he's talking about idols. He says, I am the unseen God and I predict the future. That's kind of like how God, he hangs his hat on that and says, this is how you will know that I'm the true God. And so, I mean, God himself hangs his hat on being able to predict the future, and he did it with Daniel. And just to say this, many of the prophecies in Daniel were fulfilled during the intertestamental period, but there seem to be some that have not yet been fulfilled. And so in some ways, Daniel's kind of like the Old Testament revelation in the sense that it's apocalyptic in nature, as is Revelation, which is a genre which we're not very familiar with nowadays because it's not commonly used. Mm-hmm. But it was commonly used in prophetic writing, religious writing 2,000 years ago or earlier. And so, we read it. We don't totally know what everything means, but we try to sort it out.
Yeah, no, that's good. I mean, yeah, that's the one thing about Christianity that is so amazing. It sets itself apart from so many other religions is the idea of prophecy and the fact that God speaks to his people and speaks of future events that have been fulfilled, and even Jesus himself fulfilled, what's over 300 prophecies, So, if you fulfill maybe 1, 2, 3, okay, I can stage my life, but 300, that's kind of difficult. But, I hope that gets you kind of going. Daniel's one of those books that when you get into it, it kind of opens up a lot of doors, especially then getting into Revelation and getting into the mind of God and the character of God. And we learn so much through the life of Daniel. So I hope this is not where you stop. This is kind of a doorway, a step to getting into the scriptures further and just seeing the amazing God that we serve. So if you haven't been able to listen to Sunday's message, I go over there right now, this very minute, whitefieldschurch.com, and download it and listen to it, and let us know what you think. And if you haven't been able to listen to some of the others in our series, go there, and there's been very inspiring messages over the past few Sundays on the topic of the prophets and the things.
You can listen to our podcast. So I know podcasts very popular on your phone. Go to your podcast app, look for us in the podcast search engine, Whitefields Community Church. It'll pop right up. Subscribe, and you can catch up on all the back episodes.
Yep. SoundCloud, YouTube, we're there. Ring the bell, notifications. It'll be, you'll get whenever there's something new, they'll send you an email. And so, I'm glad you were with us this week. We love to hear from you, and may God bless you.